Sampling is a very common term with computer graphics, especially with rendering. And in the most basic sense, you can think of it as the quality of the render, where the lower our sample value is, the more noisy the render result will be, and the higher the samples, the clearer your render will be, while also taking longer to finish rendering. And so the default settings for cycles is 10 samples, both for the preview and the render. The difference being I can set the preview to 5, and that governs the viewport rendering. As you can see up top, that's 5 out of 5 samples completed. But if I kick off an actual render, Cycles will break up the image into tiles, that's these orange squares, and for each of those tiles, it renders 10 samples. And so with this many samples, our image is very grainy and frankly unacceptable for final output of our image. But it is great for previewing your overall render. So now let's increase our samples to 100 and change to slot 2 and see what the difference in quality is. With 100 samples, the majority of our image is much cleaner. If I jump back previously, Alt-J, you can see that the noise is much more consistent across the image, whereas with 100 samples, it's more concentrated to specific areas, namely the light that's reflecting off of our metal cube and the light that's passing through our glass cup. Also up here, that must be reflecting from the cube as well. But let's keep in mind the difference in render time. 100 samples took 37 seconds, 10 samples took 5 seconds. So now we'll switch to slot 3 and jump to 1000 samples. Here we are, 1000 samples, took 5.5 minutes. Quite a big difference from 37 seconds for 100 samples and 5 seconds for 10, but the quality is also much higher. But even still, 1000 samples is not enough to get rid of all the noise. But at 5.5 minutes, our render times are starting to creep up. And from here, 2000 samples is going to take about 11 minutes and keep going up and up until it's impractical. And so if you think of samples as an overall quality value, and you don't mind waiting on long render times, then simply continuing to bump this value up and up is going to give you the most physically correct, noise-free render result. But most artists are not that patient, nor are production schedules. So the game of rendering becomes striking a balance between render quality and speed. And we have a couple optimization tools over to the left, but at the top we have a seed value. That's not really an optimization as much as it simply randomizes the noise pattern. So if we go back down to 10 samples, and let's see, the first render here was 10 samples, so we'll go to slot number 2 and render 10 samples with the seed value at 1 instead of 0. Now switch back with Alt-J, and you can see that the quality is not any different, but the noise pattern is jumping around. And so for stills, this isn't tremendously useful, but for animations, it's very important. Because with animation, the balance between quality and speed is crucial. And so most likely your rendering quality will still have a little bit of noise in it. However, the goal is that it's barely noticeable. But throughout a rendered sequence, if this seed setting doesn't change, then you'll notice that your noise pattern kind of swims across your scene, which actually makes the noise more noticeable. And so really the only time I use the seed is for animation. And what I recommend doing is clicking on it and typing #frame and hitting enter. You'll see that the seed turns purple, which signifies that a driver has been added. And if I step through our timeline using the right arrow key, with each new frame, the seed value matches the frame number. So we're at frame 5, seed value of 5, frame 6, seed value of 6. And the result of this is throughout the rendered sequence, your noise will constantly be changing, and that actually makes it less noticeable. Just like in the film of a movie, there's a grain pattern that comes from the camera that's constantly jittering around. So that's a very important function of the seed value. I will delete that driver, and in the next lesson we'll take a look at the clamping options below.